Alright, I've got my pan heated up here. It's a medium saucepan. I've got it heated up on medium heat, and I'm ready to start putting my sauce together. I've got all my ingredients out in front of me. I'm all ready to go. So I'm going to add olive oil to the pan first thing. We want to put enough in there to put a nice coating on the bottom. That's probably about 2 tablespoons of olive oil in the bottom of the pan. And now we can just go ahead and add our onions first thing. Here we have a nice sizzle there. We don't want them, popping and jumping all over the place. We don't want to burn them. We're going to cook these onions till they're translucent, or you can sort of start to see through them. And that'll just take a couple of minutes. Keep them stirring. What we don't want to do is brown them up on one side. We don't want that brown caramelized onion flavor in there. I mean, if you do, then by all means, brown them up a little bit. But for this sauce, I don't like it to have that sort of real browned up onion flavor. So those are about halfway to where we want them to be. I'm going to now add about 2/3 of my garlic. I am going to put a little bit of garlic aside for the end. I like to finish my tomato sauce with a little garlic in the end. Garlic adds different flavors depending on how you cook it and when you add it. So I'm going to really get it cooked in here with the onions before I add the tomatoes, and then after the sauce has simmered for a while, I'm going to throw a little garlic in at the end, and it'll give it a little bit more of that garlic bite to finish the sauce. So I'm keeping about a tablespoon of the garlic in reserve for later on. Now it is important that we salt and pepper the onions and garlic before we add the tomatoes. It just brings more of the flavor out of them. So I'm just going to take a heavy pinch of salt, maybe another one right over the top, and then some fresh ground black pepper. Give that a little mix. And you see here my onions are starting to get translucent. These are starting to glisten and shine, and you can kind of looks like you can see into them a bit. That's almost where we want them to be. Okay, so our onions are nice and translucent now. We can see into them a bit. They're steaming really well. I've still got my burner on medium heat, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add my 2 cans of tomato. We want to do this carefully. We don't want to get tomato sauce all over the place. There is, a puree that the tomatoes are canned in, and that will splatter. So I like to tip the pan and tip the candle about the same, and then slowly just pour the can in there, and that way we don't get any splashing at all. This pot is really just big enough for these 2 cans of tomato. What we're not going to want to do now is keep this on too high, or you'll see if it's too hot, it's going to start to bubble. We're not getting hot all the way through. We're just sending that boiling juice up through the canned tomatoes, and it's splattering all over. We want to try to avoid that, so we'll give it a little stir. Okay. Now we can add some of our other ingredients. I am putting some dry basil in here and some dry oregano, just about a teaspoon of each. It'll be about a half teaspoon of each per can of tomatoes. That's about a teaspoon there. We're going to put that in. A teaspoon of our oregano. I'm going to add some fresh basil and oregano to this at the end. You don't want to put your fresh herbs in really early because a lot of that flavor will just cook right out. We're going to add about a teaspoon of salt. And we're going to grind some pepper in there. And that's really it. We're going to let this come to a very slow simmer to where it's just bubbling. We can keep a lid on it. And probably once it's at that simmer, you're going to turn your burner to all the way down to a very low heat, probably 2. It depends on how hot your stove is. So we're just going to leave this now and let it simmer for a few hours, probably 3 hours before we get back to it. All right, Our tomato sauce has been simmering now for a little bit over 2 hours, which is enough time. We can let it go longer. It's time now. We're basically gonna finish it up. I'm gonna open it up here. It is just barely bubbling away, and you notice now we used whole tomatoes. So while it's broken up some, we still have big chunks of tomato in there, and we need to smooth our sauce out. First thing I'm going to do is remember that garlic that we had reserved from earlier, that raw minced garlic. I'm going to add that in now. And that's going to give it a little bit more garlic punch, and that's fine. We're looking for that. Now, when we're at the school, we would use an immersion blender like this to blend this sauce up. And I could do that here because I have one. But again, I'm trying to show you guys things that you can do at home, and I'm not so sure you're going to have something like this. Also, tomato sauce doesn't need to be super, super smooth, which is what happens when we use this. Sometimes we like it a little bit chunky, so we're going to make this one a little bit chunky. One thing you absolutely do not do is take this sauce and put it in an actual blender. That will not end well. When you put very, very hot food in an actual blender and turn it on, pressure builds up in there, and that sauce could go everywhere, and that could be very dangerous. Absolutely under no conditions do you do that. So I put my garlic in, and now we're going to take a device sort of like this, and this is the one that I have. There's different types. A handle, a flat bottom with holes, some of them have, and we're just going to smash this sauce up right there in the pot, and try not to make a huge mess with it. All right, so I'm just lifting smasher up and down, and I'm pulling the big tomatoes underneath it and crushing them up. I know that might be a little bit hard for you to see. You just want to get all those tomatoes crushed up really well so our sauce isn't too chunky. And it's going to happen real easy because these tomatoes have been simmering now for over 2 hours, so they're very, very soft, and they're going to mash up pretty easy. And you'll see our sauce is pretty smooth now, just little chunks of tomatoes, and that's absolutely fine for a pasta sauce. Give it a couple more mixes. I saw some big chunks in there still. All right, that should be good. Now, this is optional, but if you have it, by all means use it. I was lucky enough that my neighbor has a little herb garden, and she provided me with some fresh basil and some fresh oregano. By all means, if you have fresh basil, you want to add that in the end. If you don't have it, the sauce is still good like this. We would give it a little taste for salt and pepper. If we wanted to add a little bit more dry herbs, we could do that. But in this case, we've got the fresh herbs, so we are going to use them. We're going to take the leaves off our basil first. I've already washed it off. We don't want to use the stem. Just going to pull all our basil leaves off. And how much basil, fresh herbs you use is really up to you. I like a lot of basil. It really does make the sauce excellent. So I'm going to use quite a bit here. And remember, this is a double batch of sauce. I'm going to take those leaves, I'm going to put them all together, and I'm just going to roll them up. Just going to roll them up. And then we're going to take our knife and come through them very, very thin as we possibly can. You do want to use a sharp knife to do this. If your knife's not sharp, it's going to bruise the basil, and the basil will start to turn black. Just nice thin strips. Thin strips like this is called a chiffonade, and that's the type of cut that we generally use on basil. We don't want to chop basil up or mince it up and go through it a bunch of times because, like I said, it'll bruise and it'll start to turn black. So I've got my chiffonade there, or basil. I'm just going to take that and put it right into my sauce. And now I can cut up the oregano. Oregano, we're just going to peel off the stem like this. We just want the leaves, not the stem. Man, this stuff really does smell good. The basil and oregano smell amazing. The whole house right now smells like tomato sauce. And once we put this in there, it's going to be very aromatic. I got my pile of leaves, and I'm just going to go through this like one time, nice and fine. Doesn't matter if there's some big chunks of leaves in there. Put that fresh oregano right into the sauce. Give this a stir. Ooh. Try not to melt a handle on the stove top. That does look good. And now, final thing, we want to taste our sauce. I've got some tasting spoons here. We're basically just tasting for salt and pepper at this point. It's pretty good. It needs a little bit more salt. And just do this in small amounts. Add a little bit of salt, give it a few minutes for that salt to really melt in there, and then taste it again. So right now I'm just going to give it a couple good pinches of salt. I'm going to give it a couple turns of fresh ground pepper. And I always like to finish my tomato sauce with a good dose of extra virgin olive oil at the end. We're just going to do that real quick. We're going to give it a stir, and we're going to let it simmer for no more than about another half hour before it's ready to use. Now, of course, you can take this sauce after it's done. You can refrigerate it if you're going to use it in the next few days. If you want to hold on to it for a while, it absolutely can be frozen and then used at a later date. It's really easy to make one day and then have it ready for, meals to come in the future. So in our next segment, I'm going to show you how to make chicken parmesan using this sauce, and we'll serve that with some spaghetti. We'll see you then.